Welcome to this YSL tutorial on Report Builder 2016. In this part of the series we're going to look at some basic techniques for working with tables. We'll begin by showing you several ways you can insert a table into a report, and then the basics of selecting, moving and deleting them. We'll look at a couple of methods for assigning fields to columns in a table, and then how you can select single and multiple cells in a table before applying some formatting options to them. We'll have a section on how you can control row heights and column widths, including a tip about how to add tooltips to cells so that an end user can still see all of the details of a column even if the column isn't wide enough to display it. Finally, we'll look at duplicating tables and then modifying the dataset assigned to a table that you've copied. So there's quite a bit to get through. Let's get started. To get started, I've created a brand new blank report in Report Builder, and I'm going to start by creating a new data source which connects to the YSL Movies database. If you don't already have a copy of that, we have a video that explains exactly how to install it, and there's a link in the video description that gives you access to the script you'll need. Assuming that you've done all that, let's head back to Report Builder, right-click the Data Sources folder and choose to add a new data source. I'll call the data source Movies. If you've followed along with previous videos in this series, you may already have a shared Movies data source, which you're more than welcome to use. Just in case you haven't done that previously, I'm going to choose to create an embedded connection. I'm going to build it using the build tool. I'll enter my server name, which is, in my case, SQL 2016 training. And then I can select my database name from the drop-down list, and I'm going to select Movies. I'll test the connection just to make sure it works. Hit OK a couple of times, and there's the data source created. Now that we have the data source, we can right-click on it and choose to add a data set. I'll call this dataset Winners, and what it's going to do is display a list of all the Oscar-winning films from the film table in the Movies database. I'll use the query designer to build this relatively quickly, and from the list that appears, I'll expand the tables folder, expand the film table, and I'm going to include the title, the release date, the budget dollars, box office dollars, and the Oscar wins fields, so 5 fields altogether. To make sure that I only get the Oscar winners, I'm going to use the filters tool, so I'm going to click the add filter button, change the field to Oscar wins, change the operator to is more than, and then change the value to a 0. I can then click OK and click OK again, and there's my data set ready to populate a table. Just before I create my first table, I'm going to right-click on this default title text box and choose to delete it, just to give myself a little more space. I've then got several choices for inserting a table into the report. I can use the Insert tab in the ribbon and find the Table tool, and then choose from a couple of different options. There's a table wizard, which can be helpful when you want to create tables including groups, but for a basic table of the type I'm about to create here, it's a little bit over the top. Instead, I'm going to choose Insert Table, and then I can either just click once in the body of the report, or click and drag to draw a table of a size that I would like. When I release the mouse button, the table would be created. There is a slightly quicker technique I can use to insert a table. Simply by right-clicking into the body of the report, I can choose Insert, followed by Table, to insert a table at the point that I right-clicked. I don't currently need 2 tables in my report, so let's delete one of them. I'd like to delete the first table that I drew. To do that, I'll need to first select the table. One technique I can use to do that involves clicking into any single cell in the table first, followed by clicking on the little grey square that appears in the top left-hand corner of the table. When I do that, you'll see the selection handles appear around the border of the table. I can then just press the Delete key on my keyboard to delete that object. A slightly quicker way to select a table. Let's say I wanted to move this second table up into the top left-hand corner of the report. One way to select it is to draw a box which partially encloses it. If I start with the mouse cursor in a blank part of the report body, I can click and drag, and as long as the box I draw partially encloses the table, when I release the mouse button, the table will be selected. To move it, I can subsequently click and drag on the Select and Move cursor to reposition it anywhere within the body of the report. I'll drag it up to the top left-hand corner and release the mouse button to finish repositioning it. Next, I'd like to assign some fields from my dataset to the various columns of my table. As with many things in Report Builder, there are several ways I can do that. One technique involves hovering the mouse cursor over a cell in the data row of the table. You should be able to make out when you insert a table it comes along with two rows, a header row and a data row. If you position the mouse cursor over a cell in the data row, you see a little field selector tool appears. You can click on this selector tool to assign a field to that column. So let's do that for the first column in the table. I can add the title column to the first column of the table. You can also assign a field to the table by clicking and dragging it from the Report Data window. Let's do that with the release date field. If I click and drag release date and position it over the second column of the table, when I release the mouse button, the field will be inserted. Using the field selector is probably the quickest way to assign a field to the table, but the click and drag method is still useful, especially if you run out of columns to assign fields to. Let's add the budget dollars field to the third column of the table, and then to get more space to add more columns, I've got two choices. I can choose to insert a new column into the table by right-clicking on the header of one of the existing columns. I can then choose to insert a new column by choosing left or right, and then I can use the field selector to assign my next field. Alternatively, I could have just clicked and dragged a column from the Report Data window. Let's drag the Oscar wins column. If I drag this, I can see that when I drag to the left or the right of an existing column, I get a blue vertical line appearing. This indicates where the new column will be added to. So I can attach it to the end of the table, or I can insert it in between any two existing columns, as I'm going to do right here. One slightly annoying feature of tables in Report Builder is that it isn't easy to move columns. For example, if I wanted to move my Oscar wins column so that it sits between release date and budget dollars. In products such as Excel and other Microsoft tools you may have used, you'd be able to highlight the entire column by clicking on its header, and then hover the mouse over the border that appears and click and drag to move it, but that simply doesn't work in Report Builder. The simplest, shortest way you can achieve this is by simply dragging the field you want to move from the Report Data window into the place you wanted it to appear, and then deleting the column that you didn't want at all. So I can right click at the top of the Oscar wins column here and then choose to delete that column. So it's not particularly elegant, but at least there is that simple approach. Of course, it is possible to use the field selector to change which field belongs to a column. The problem with doing this, if I try to change Oscar wins here to the budget dollars column, for example, you'll notice that although it changes which field is displayed, it doesn't change the header of that particular column, so I'd have to edit that manually. Let's just undo that to get back to the Oscar wins column. On the subject of changing column headers, that's certainly easy enough to do, although Report Builder does try its best to help you out so that hopefully you won't need to do that too often. You may be able to spot a couple of things that Report Builder does. If I zoom in a little bit so you can see the difference between the field name on the data row and the column header in the header row. Oscar wins has no space between the two words Oscar and wins, nor does budget dollars between budget and dollars, and yet the column headers have automatically received a space between the words that make up the field name. Report Builder checks for certain styles of capitalization in field names. It also checks for things like underscores, another common way to separate words in a field name. And underscores will be replaced with spaces, and spaces will be placed automatically between words for, just before capitalization of a new word. If you do need to change things, that's still absolutely fine. I can edit the text in a header cell quite easily. I can click into this text with the text cursor. I can select text that I wanted to delete, for example, and then backspace or edit the text, type in new text in the standard way. Don't be tempted to press enter to enter your changes. If I press enter, that just throws a new line in the header. So let's backspace that so I only get a single line. I can then click into another part of the report or another cell. Let's get rid of the word dollars from the box office dollars column header as well by selecting the text and backspacing that. And then I can click into another part of the report to accept those changes. At this point, it's probably worth checking what a report will look like to an end user. It wouldn't be much use if this was all they saw. Report Builder's design view is not what you see is what you get. To see what the report really looks like, you'll need to run it. Just to explain what will happen with tables by looking at the indicators that appear, if I click into a single cell within the table, you can see a couple of different symbols appear to the left-hand side. Rows which have these three horizontal bars indicate data rows or detail rows, and the symbol there indicates that this structure or this sort of template for this row will be repeated for every row that's currently visible in the dataset. So what we should see if I zoom back out again and then run the report is that that structure is repeated for every single film in the dataset of Oscar winners. Now, although this is much more useful for an end user, it's still far from perfect. There are plenty of formatting changes we can make to this. Let's start by formatting the release date to exclude the time component and then make the date a little less ambiguous. Depending on what region you're using, it's not easy to tell whether this date here represents the 6th of November or whether it's June the 11th, so let's make that a little easier to read. If we switch back to the design view first, to format a value in a cell containing a field name, it's important to select that cell first. Now this is something you need to be slightly careful of. I need to select the cell or the text box that the field belongs to, not the text in the text box itself. You can see there are two different mouse cursors when you hover the mouse over a cell containing a field. If I position the mouse over the text, I'll see that I get the standard text cursor, and if I click with that cursor, it selects the text in the box, not the text box itself. I'm going to move away and click away from that cell. If I position the mouse cursor over the cell so that I can see this northwest arrow, the standard arrow pointing to the northwest, I can click with that symbol to highlight the entire text box, not just a small part of the text within it. And that's what I want to do to format the date in this box. There are three main ways to format any element of a report in Report Builder. The simplest but perhaps most limited is to look for a tool in the Home tab of the ribbon. So having selected the release date cell, I can find the number section in the Home tab of the ribbon, and there's a drop-down list which allows me to apply one of the bog standard default formats. So using this drop-down list, I can choose date, and then if I run the report just to check what's happened, I can hopefully see that the time component has been removed, although it hasn't changed the ambiguity of the month and the day portion of the date. Let's return to the design view and look at an alternative approach for formatting the release date. This time I'm going to right-click on the release date text box, again making sure that I'm not using the text cursor, I'm using the arrow cursor instead. If I right-click on the text box with the arrow cursor displayed, I'll have the option to choose Text Box Properties. When I do that, a dialog box will appear that allows me to access a far greater variety of number formatting options. Here I'll click on the Number tab of the Text Box Properties dialog box, and this gives me access to way more properties than I had earlier on. So now I can scroll through the list until I find a format that I like the look of. I'm going to go with this one, 31 Jan 2000. So the the number of the day of the month, followed by a short name for the month, followed by the 4-digit year. If I click OK and then run the report again, this time I'll see that I get a somewhat less ambiguous date format. Now let's look at how we can apply a better format to the budget and box office columns. We'd like to perhaps display a currency symbol as well as commas to make the numbers a little more readable. Let's head back to the design view, and ideally I'd like to use the same dialog box I've just used to format the date to format both budget and box office at the same time. I can select multiple cells in a couple of ways in a table. One way is to hover the mouse over an existing cell, making sure that it's not selected already. And as long as I can see the northwest arrow cursor, I can click and drag in one motion to highlight two cells. One thing that people frequently get wrong on training courses is they will select a cell first and then release the mouse button, and then click and drag again, which doesn't quite work, as you can see. So the key is to position the mouse over an unselected cell and then click and drag without releasing the mouse button until you've reached the end. An alternative way to do that is to click on a single cell in the table and then hold down either the Control key or the Shift key before clicking on the next. If I hold down the Control key or the Shift key in this case, clicking on the next cell will extend the selection. The difference between holding Control and Shift is when you click on cells that aren't next to each other. If I click on the title cell and then hold down the Control key and click on the box office cell, it selects just those two cells. If I go back and select the title cell and then hold down the Shift key this time before selecting box office dollars, it will extend the selection to include all the cells in between. Anyway, whichever of those techniques you'd like to use, I want to select both the budget and the box office dollars cells. Now I'd like to apply a currency format, and although there is a tempting looking dollar symbol on the toolbar, I'd like to see what extra options I have, like I did for dates using the text box properties dialog box. However, if I try to right click on any of the selected cells, I'll find that the text box properties option is greyed out. I can't select it. The properties dialog box can only be displayed for one single item at a time. So what we'll do to handle this is start by applying the standard currency formats by clicking the currency button on the toolbar. You can see that the currency option has been selected. I could have selected it from the drop down list here as well. If I then return to run the report, I can see what that looks like. Now unfortunately this isn't quite right. The budget and box office figures are actually in dollars, but report builders use my regional settings to apply a pound sterling symbol. It's also kind of unnecessarily applied a couple of decimal places. I'd like to modify these options for both cells at the same time. So I'm going to head back to the design view and look at the third way to modify the properties of an item in a report. To format these two selected cells, I'm going to use the properties window on the right hand side of the screen. If you can't see the properties window, you can head to the View tab in the ribbon and choose to display the properties window by checking its box. You can show and hide this panel at any point by doing that. With these two cells selected, if I scroll down far enough in the properties window, I'll encounter a section called Number and then a property in there called Format. I currently have my property list sorted into different sections. They're categorized. You can show the entire list in a simple alphabetically ordered list by switching between the two views using these buttons at the top of the properties window. You get the same list of properties just in a different order. If I look at the format property, I can see how it's been constructed and I can clearly see where the pound symbols are. Rather than using pound symbols, I can replace those with dollar symbols instead. I can hopefully see there where the decimal places is as well, the decimal point, so I can delete the decimal point and the 2 zeros to the right of that. I'll then need to do the same thing for the negative number section of the number format. By the way, if you're not familiar with how these number formats work, don't worry too much. They're very similar to how they work in Excel, but if you've not used this technique in Excel before, we'll cover this in a separate topic in a later video in the series. For now, that's the number format that I'd like to apply. So I can now run the report again, and this time I should see that I get my numbers formatted in the way that I do want. Next, I'd like to apply some formatting to all of the cells in the header row of the table, and this is mainly to show you how easy it is to select an entire table row. Let's switch back to the design view. Now of course we could use the techniques we saw earlier by clicking and dragging or by using the Shift and Control keys, but it's much easier to select an entire row by selecting any single cell in the table and then clicking on the grey box that appears next to the row you want to select. From there we can apply any formatting options we like using the Properties window or by using the Home tab in the ribbon. Because we have multiple text boxes selected, we can't use the text box properties to do this, to format all the cells at the same time. Let's just apply a basic background colour using the Fill Colour tool, and then we can apply a different font colour using the Font Colour tool, and then we can maybe make the font bold. We could modify the font size, we could maybe modify the font being used as well. Let's go for a slightly different font, let's go for Calibri font, there we go. The last thing I'd like to do for this table is control the height of the rows. You probably already notice when we run the report, films whose title is too long for the width of the column simply increases the height of the row, which looks a little bit odd. A simple way to solve this is to just increase the width of the column so that it's wide enough to display everything on one row. Unfortunately, you don't get much help with that. If you're used to working in Excel, you'll know that you can, or you'll probably know, hopefully, that you can double click between any two column headers to make the columns the exact width of all the text in that column. Unfortunately, that doesn't work in Report Builder because in Design View there's no way to predict how long the text will be. You can still click and drag manually, but it is a little bit of a suck it and see kind of approach. You can adjust the column width and then run the report and check. I still haven't made it quite wide enough for a couple of films, so I have to go back to Design View and then make it a little wider again, and so on and so on and so on, until it looks like the report looks sensible. However, if the data behind the report changes and some new film titles get added that are even longer, that will have the same effect. So I'll find odd-sized rows in the same table, and I don't want that to happen. To stop the row heights changing automatically, I can change a property of the text box containing the text that is too long. So I can right-click on the title text box, and I can choose Text Box Properties. On the first page of the dialog box, the general page, there's a checkbox that allows the height of a row to increase. If I uncheck that box and then click OK. By the way, this is the same as changing the can grow property of the text box. If I have this title text box selected, in the properties window in the general section, there's a can grow property. So when that is set to false, the row height can't increase. If I were to change the width of my column so that it's quite narrow again, just to prove that this is the case, if I run the report again, I'll see now that the titles that were longer earlier on no longer cause the row heights to increase. Now, although this is obviously a lot neater, it's not really a great idea to hide some of the film titles from the end user. So what we'll do to make it a little more user-friendly is add a tooltip to the title text box that shows the full film title if we position the mouse cursor over the film name. Let's head back to the design view, and we can do this again in a couple of ways. We can use the text box properties dialog box of the title text box, or we can use the properties window on the right hand side. The property we're interested in is tooltip. Just because it's ever so slightly easier, I'm going to right-click on the title text box and choose Text Box Properties. I can see the tooltip property on the same general page as we've just used to disallow the height increases. What I want to display in the tooltip is the value of the title field. Now, unfortunately, I can't select the title field from a drop-down list, as I could, for instance, to select which value is displayed in the text box itself. But it's easy enough here just to copy and paste this text if I select the title text and copy it, and then paste it into this tooltip text box. It's important that we use these square brackets to enclose the title, so you can see that the name at the top represents the header text, the label. The value displayed is linked to the title field of the dataset, so that's why it's enclosed in square brackets. We want our tooltip to display the value of the title field, not just the word title, so the square brackets are important there as well. Having done that, if I click OK and then run the report again, now when I position the mouse cursor over any film title, but especially ones which don't display the full film name in the cell, I can see the tooltip appears, showing me the actual details of that film. For the final part of the video, I'd like to create a second table which shows a list of the films which didn't win any Oscars. To start with, let's head back to the design view, and I'll need to create a second dataset called Losers that I can use to populate my next table. Now, unfortunately, there's no quick, simple way to copy and paste an entire dataset. I can right-click, but there's no option to copy and paste. But we can cheat a little bit just by copying the query that's been used to build this dataset. If you double-click the winner's dataset name, in the dialog box that appears, you can see the SQL query that's been used to generate this dataset. You can highlight all of that text and then choose to copy it, and then close down this dialog box. You can then right-click on the movie's data source and choose to add a new dataset. I'll change its name so that it's called Losers. It's a little harsh, but there you go, that's Hollywood. I can then paste in my query into the query box. And what I'd like to do is edit the where clause to show only films whose Oscar wins equals 0. So I can just modify this text so that I don't use the greater than symbol, I replace that with an equals operator instead. When I've done that, I can click OK, and then my second data set has been created. Now, of course, I could just go through the same process I've gone through to build my first table. I could right-click into the report and choose to insert a new table. I could then begin assigning fields to it in the same way I've done previously. When I have multiple data sets in the report, it's worthwhile pointing out that I first of all have to choose which data source I'm using, followed by which data set I'm using, and then the field that I want to use. That's all a little tedious, especially if I have to go through the same process to provide the formatting for the date and the budget and box office columns. So instead, what we'll do is delete this extra table to start with, and then make a copy of our existing table. I'm going to highlight it by dragging a box which partially encloses it, press Ctrl and C to copy it, and then Ctrl and V to paste it. I can then reposition it using the select and move cursor and position that somewhere towards the right hand side. I'll leave a little bit of a gap there. Now at the moment, this table is using the same data set as my original table, so I'm showing the Oscar winners, and of course I don't want that to happen. So what I'd like to do now is change that table's data set to use the losers data set instead. This will only work, by the way, because the column names in the two data sets match exactly. Without the column names matching, this process is a lot trickier to achieve. Anyway, because our data sets match their column names, we can select a single cell in this new table, and then we can right click on any of the little grey boxes around the outside of the table. I'm going to right click on the top left hand corner grey square. This gives me the option to choose something called tablix properties or tablix properties. The word tablix or tablix comes from the names of 3 different report items: a table, a list and a matrix. So those 3 items are very similar to each other, so they all use the same dialog box. Anyway, if I view this tablix or tablix properties dialog, I can see that on the general page of this dialog, I can choose which dataset is used to populate this table, and currently it's set to winners. All I need to do now is choose the losers dataset from the drop-down list and then click OK, and I've changed the dataset associated with that table. It may be worthwhile adding a header row to each table to indicate what films they are displaying. So to insert a row into a table, we can click into any single cell that belongs to the table already. If I click into a cell in the header row and then right click on the grey box to the left of that row, I can choose to insert a new row. I'll go above, and then I can type in a new title in one of these text boxes. It might be nicer to merge the cells so that they span the entire width of the table, so that involves selecting all of the cells in that row, and you can use any of the techniques we looked at earlier. You can then right click on one of those selected cells and choose to merge them. Having done that, I can type in my new title, so this is the Oscar winners, and then I can do the exact same thing for the second table. I can select a cell within it, right click on the grey box next to the header row, insert a row above. I can highlight all of the cells in that row, right click, merge cells, and then type in Oscar losers. Some different formatting might make sense as well, perhaps changing the background colour of each cell. Let's put the losers in hot pink and the winners in a lovely shade of lime green. Beautiful. And then we can run the report, and this time we'll see 2 separate lists using the same table formatting, so you can see that the column formatting is the same for budget and box office and for the release dates, but with a minimum amount of effort. Okay, well that covers all of the basic techniques for tables I'd like to talk about for now. There are plenty more techniques to cover, but we'll save those for later videos in this series. Thanks for watching, see you next time.